I introduce this evening's speaker, I'd just like to remind everyone that next week there is no seminar. It's reading week next week. So the next time we meet will be in 2 weeks' time. Okay, without further ado, let me please introduce Pierre Giorgio Donatelli from the Sapienza Università di Roma. And tonight, Pierre Giorgio is going to be speaking on initiation and education, Wittgenstein, Cavell, and children. So over to you, Pierre Giorgio.
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you to Paul for this very kind invitation. And so actually now maybe it's useful that I share the screen that I'm using a talk that I gave already one time, which is about the role of the child in Cavell and also in Wittgenstein's philosophy. So I hope this can be of some usefulness for you for this seminar. So thank you again for this kind invitation. We're really very happy to be with you this evening. And let me try to do this. Let's see whether I can do it. Okay, can you see my paper? Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah, I need to move it because I never know how to read and then not having all the pictures on the right. Okay, let me do this. So the paper, as I said, is about, well, Stanley Cavell's The Claim of Reason, but more generally about the notions of education, initiation, and around then the figure of the child in Wittgenstein's philosophy. And this in turn connects to Cavell's elaboration of the appeal to forms of life in philosophy. This is connected. Stanley Cavell emphasizes the role of the child in Wittgenstein's investigations in what he calls the scenes of instruction. This is a very important idea for Cavell and for Wittgenstein. At the beginning of the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein writes that children use primitive forms of language, such as those primitive language games that he introduces starting from the quotation from Augustine. So this is Philosophical Investigation 5, the last two lines. Wittgenstein writes, a child uses such primitive forms of language when he learns to talk. Here, the teaching of language is not explaining, but training. End of quote. Children show what it means to be trained into a language, to be brought into it. So in a way, they are taken as examples of this. And Wittgenstein aligns the education of children with his examples of the apples, of the builders, with his examples of primitive language games. As Cavell has remarked, it is difficult to imagine, say, the builders, when one shouts, give me this, it simply says a word and then the object is brought over. Cavell has famously remarked that it is difficult to imagine what the builders do and say as offering a whole language, a complete life. Their life appears too mechanical. This is Cavell's comment, and too primitive. Maybe it is not fully human, robot-like. It lacks freedom, or at least a degree of freedom and the larger space for movement of any sort that we expect from human beings. If the children's world, therefore, is like the one of the builders, it seems to be the world of very primitive human beings, perhaps not really and fully human. So I start with this kind of comparison. This primitivity signals what Cavell calls a scene of initiation. And this is a very important thing in the Claim of Reason. Children are initiated into the life with language, with the concepts of pumpkins, love, animals, justice. These are examples from Stanley Cavell's The Claim of Reason. One of Cavell's points in The Claim of Reason is to show that children take so much from us, remaining, though, as it were, in their world. A world which gradually gets richer and deeper and transforms into our world in adolescence and adulthood through education and experience. It is a primitive world because what we have in common is the words we use in teaching. What we have in common with children is the words we use in teaching and the gestures and the surroundings, but the forms of life which make something of those words and gestures is largely absent or minimally present. In this same vein, Cavell writes in Conditions Handsome and Unhandsome that children steal language, and culture from us. So here's this picture of stealing. What strikes me about, this is quotation from Conditions. What strikes me about Augustine's description is how isolated the child appears, training its own mouth to form signs, something you might expect of a figure in a Beckett play, the unobserved observer of the culture. The scene portrays language as an inheritance, but also as one that has, as it were, to be stolen. Anyway, in which the capacity and perhaps the motivation to take it is altogether greater than the capacity and perhaps the motivation to give it. Take it from the child and give it from the educator, from the adults, from the grown-ups. Children are, apart from us, isolated creatures like primitive, savages, aliens of some sorts. And the reverse is true as well. As Cavell remarks, again in quotes, Wittgenstein stories using mathematical imageries about the wood sellers and others read from a step away as though their characters are children. So in this line of comment, this is meant to argue for the fact that children are initiated into a culture which they will master only as grown-ups. As children, they participate to it only as passive trainees. So we have this couple of comparison. Children are like primitives and primitives are like children. So this is what is going on in Cavell and Wittgenstein. Further consideration connected to this one is the following. What the builders do, what children do, can be seen as a primitive form of language in a highly simplified context where words, actions, objects are traded. And so there is a point to do it. There are many points to this. And there is a point in particular that I'm going to comment here in these lines. That is the materiality of the context emphasized by looking at language under the form of primitive language games helps to dismantle the fantasy, the meaning, and understanding requires spiritual entities floating, as it were, above this materiality. As Wittgenstein writes, what do the words of this language signify? How is what they signify supposed to come out other than the kind of use they have? And we have already described that, end of quote. On the other hand, this materiality shows, as it were, the enormity of what is left out. It shows that we need more aspects of this life to make it a human life, or let's say fully human life, a life which hosts spontaneity, naturalness, easiness, freedom. Yet we can also see mechanization from the point of view broached by this idea of primitive language games. We can also see mechanization as an internal possibility of our forms of life, as a loss of what? Perhaps of a larger offer of moves. In order to have a context of speech and mutual understanding, which we inhabit naturally in a spontaneous manner, we need to be able to make an indefinite number of moves, moves which operate on and around these primitive moves, to have a sense of the point of asking, for the meaning, the occasion, and the subtleties of human communication. This is Cavell, of course. And we may experience that we have lost such a capacity and that our linguistic moves are too simplified and mechanical, somehow necessitated and forced on us. This was in parentheses. So the primitivity signs, of course, a possibility, a kind of impoverishment, a mechanization of our linguistic forms of life and also of our forms of life. The seeing of instruction tells something also about adults. So the seeing of instruction tells something about the children compared to primitivity, children. It also tells something about adults. And the point here is that adults educate children into something which is much more and so much different from the little they offer with their teaching. This is an important point for Cavell. They, the adults, bring them into a whole form of life by very poor instruments. The instruments cannot really be equated to what the educators succeed, if they do, to realize with them, through them. This point is a comment, perhaps, on the idea that education, when education is successful, does this without offering a completely spelled out list of criteria or instructions of what adds up to the human form of life. and to the various forms of life hosted in it. That is, the forms of life around, say, the concept of pumpkins, Halloween, justice, democracy. I mean that the form of life with the notion of pumpkin hosts the possibility of having stories about Halloween, and the form of life around justice hosts the possibility of having forms of life around democracy, etc. Cavell writes, in learning language, you do not merely learn the pronunciation of sounds and their grammatical orders, but the forms of life which make those sounds the words they are, do what they do. For example, name, call, point, express a wish or affection, indicate a choice or an aversion, etc. And Wittgenstein sees the relation among these forms as grammatical. Also, this brings together the idea that intellectual and human activities are to be accounted in terms of the forms of life in which they have a place and role, and that this account cannot be spelled out as the operation of some self-enclosed normative principle. The appeal to forms of life goes together, therefore, with the thesis about the non-codifiability of the knowledge of what constitutes the normativity of a certain sphere of human activity. This is super short, but I think that this idea of bringing children, of initiating children into a form of life with very poor instruments tells something about the idea that the normative knowledge that we have in our world actually depends on forms of life, and it is very difficult to actually translate this knowledge in a list of normative criteria. So this is something, of course, that belongs also to the region of Wittgenstein philosophy around the notion of rule following. So there are many, of course, moments in Wittgenstein philosophy where this is, or it could be taken as the idea that normative knowledge belongs to the entire cohesion of a form of life, in the entire Gewimmel, in the entire hurly-burly of a form of life, as he says in the remarks on the philosophy of psychology. So the concept of initiation, I make here very, gigantic evocations of very large philosophical traditions. I think that this concept of initiation, the initiation that adults do with children in this, at the beginning of philosophical investigation, in certain moments of Cavell's claim of reason, this concept of initiation is a home in a general picture of human practices, very much familiar in philosophy, which runs, being very charitably, from Aristotle to Hegel to Dewey to Gadamer to McDowell. I have here on it, but maybe we can skip it. In ethics, it works well with the idea that morality is a matter of being properly brought up through the education of character and the participation in the life of a community. In writing this, I have especially John McDowell in mind. We are trained before being educated properly, as we are brought in the world of virtue before we can question its credentials, according to McDowell's rendition of Aristotle. We need to have acquired technically the ethical virtues of character before we can properly use our reason. So the general perspective is the Aristotelian perspective, in which is not an intellectualist perspective. That is, reason works well if it is reason works while it is ingrained in good character. So to make a very schematic thing that we all know, the intellectualist, the Socratic intellectualism, you basically have knowledge which brings with it also character. With the Aristotle, you need character, and reason is ingrained in character. And in modernity, say with Hobbes or important strengths, utilitarianism, reason or intelligence works autonomously. It doesn't need character. So here we have a tradition which you need to be brought up, character needs to be educated, and you need to be educated also to social forms of life, and intelligence belongs to this kind of education. And this is a familiar picture that you find in Aristotle, in Hegel, and in this kind of tradition. I skip this, but let me summarize it. So the idea is that normative mastery that we have is connected to participate to forms of life, and the kind of reflexivity typical of this normative provinces ethics within it. This kind of reflexivity is something that needs to be explained from the point of view of forms of life. It cannot be explained only as a mere rule follower. Being able to follow a rule, being able to grasp a concept is something that is seen in many details that belong to forms of life. It cannot be seen only from the internal point of view of following a rule. And this is a Wittgensteinian point that we find in a tradition which can actually draw together many authors. Maybe I can skip this because it is actually an aside. And actually the end of this section was that we can also think of a certain rigidity, a certain vigilance as a mechanization. So this entire discussion of how human beings can become mechanistic, I will get back to that later, the mechanization of conduct, of life, which is a modernist theme that you find in Musil, that you find in Freud, that you find in Wittgenstein and in Cavell. This idea of the mechanization, of becoming too rigid, is tied to the idea of overemphasis about rules and having lost the kind of confidence and naturalness that belongs to a natural participation to forms of life. So maybe the summary was worse than having read the entire section. Now, I want to make another move. I've commented so far on the fact that children need to be educated into our culture, and that this describes a scene of initiation, according to Cavell. And as grown-ups, we need to be reminded that our intellectual human activities are part of a form of life, that we do not do everything by ourselves, and that there is a world out there, there is language and a community of people. We are not like children trained to do singular activities. We are supposed to speak for in the name of this larger world, which makes it possible for us to pursue our activities and lead our lives. The asymmetry between adults and children in the scene of initiation is supposed to speak about this. Cavell then introduces a different idea, according to which adults also need education. There is the famous expression, the philosophy is the education for grown-ups, a famous statement that Cavell makes in The Claim of Reason. Adults also need education and are like children in a way, yet the education they need is entirely different from the one children receive. This is the second stage, then I have a third stage. Cavell writes, this is again Claim of Reason. Why do we take it that because we then must put away childish things, we must put away the prospect of growth and the memory of childhood? The anxiety in teaching, in serious communication, is that I myself require education. And for grown-ups, this is not natural growth, but change. Conversion, alluded in the lines before, is a turning of our natural reactions. So it is symbolized as rebirth. It is, end of quote, it is crucial for the life of grown-ups that their world comes to be experienced as questioned and perhaps lost, that the sources of confidence in one's culture and in oneself are shaken. As Cavell says elsewhere in Claim of Reason, I may find my answers to the children thin. I may feel run out of reasons without being willing to say, this is what I do, what I say, what I sense, what I know, and honor that. These are the moments in which my natural reactions, the inclinations that were forged when I was a child, need to be turned, converted, in order to form the basis of a different sense of what is natural. We may say that we require from adults that their habitation in the world, in their society and culture, but also the habitation with themselves, the proximity to themselves, the peculiar source of their reliance in themselves, be receptive and ready to accommodate and domesticate these sorts of losses, capable of going on, broaching new continuities of their life forms. Adults, in this perspective, now are not children. They inhabit language and the world in this peculiar manner. They can lose their world and work toward earning it again in a new way. They lose their world and may find it again, or not at all. Children cannot lose their world because they don't properly have a world. They haven't been trained enough into it in order to be able to claim their habitation in it, to be able to speak for it. So the kind of exposed habitation in the world, which Cavell elaborates, and which signals a crucial modernist issue to be found certainly in Wittgenstein, introduces an important opposition, the picture of initiation. So this is something that I say, and then I'm going to revise it. The picture of initiation works for children. Children are initiated into a form of life. Adults are educated to loss and change. So this is the second stage. Perhaps the education needed by grown-ups should be thought in connection to adolescence. So we should put children aside for a moment to think of what we call adolescence. That is, in Cavell's words, to the time of what thinkers such as Emerson, Thoreau, and Nietzsche, for example, speak of as youth, and sometimes explicitly address. And Cavell continues, the suggestion here is that the step into adulthood is not established by continuing to grow naturally, but requires one's intervention in one's own life, making it one's own. This is the moment philosophers might view or project as consent to the society of one's predecessors, or, still following Cavell, this is me now speaking, we might add the moment when they refuse to give consent, that is more broadly the moment of the critical examination of one's culture in order to be able to consent to it, to claim responsibility for it. And the parenthesis is actually about the kinds of philosophies that actually have this issue in their philosophies, and the philosophies that don't have this issue. So this is a super interesting thing. Of course, the Alcibiades, I mean, the Socratic Plato, but Plato, the whole Plato, as of course this idea of the stages of life and what we might call adolescence being a very significant phase. And then you go to, say, Roman philosophy with the Stoics, and being old, what they consider old, is a new stage of life of importance. And then you have little kids, the Renaissance. Okay, so we have a whole story, but we are in a seminar of philosophy education, so I don't want to say very superficial things, but stages of life from the point of view of philosophy is something interesting to ponder, to think about. Now, we have reached an interesting moment. Initiation has come in view as the kind of training which shapes natural propensities into the mature life of language, culture, and ethics. It is a picture of education which can bring together, with a charitable reading, different authors such as Aristotle and Wittgenstein, McDowell and Cavell. So from the point of view of initiation, Aristotle and Wittgenstein, McDowell and Cavell can be grouped together. This sort of initiation, though, does not seem to be the adequate kind of picture for the adult life of human beings according to the, what I call here, modernist understanding, to the Cavellian understanding elaborated by Cavell himself. In this context, we should better contrast Cavell against McDowell and Wittgenstein against Aristotle. If we think of the kind of education the grown-ups need as a sort of remodeling the natural propensities, this is something that it is difficult to be found in the Nicomachean ethics or in the kind of virtue ethics exposed by John McDowell. And this is actually the position of Cavell. So we have an interesting contrast here that we can talk about. If we need to be reminded of a previous stage of our growth, we need to think of adolescence, as I said before, where a radical interrogation of culture is developed together with the total absorption in one's commitments. We may go back to Emerson on this, and this kind of fun, actually, quotation. The nonchalance of boys, maybe we can also say girls now, the nonchalance of boys were sure of a dinner and would disdain as much as a lord to do or say or to conciliate one, is the healthy attitude of human nature. So there's a model in the boys and girls for human nature. How is a boy the master of society? Independent, irresponsible, looking out from his corner on such people and facts as pass by, you must court him, he does not court you. It seems so that initiation is a place to look in order to understand how we were trained into a culture, how a whole culture rests on such acts of training, on such primitive, we said, and shaky basis. Cavell writes that when philosophers speak in the name of what we all know, the claims made by philosophers who proceed from the examination of ordinary language, in such appeals, such a philosopher is voicing, reminding us of statements of initiation, telling himself or herself and us how, in fact, we must go about things. This is a knowledge of what we all know, which echoes what Cavell calls the voice of correctness, against which he places the voice of temptation in the dialogue of the investigations. The role of the child in this context is that of reminding us of what we all know. But what we all know, and this is the second stage, can falsify and leave us isolated from it, in need of a reconfiguration of our shared culture. The adolescent perhaps comes in view at this point as a figure of reference as in order to illustrate the need to question one's culture. So this is one conclusion that may be drawn from the previous considerations with the two stages. So we have initiation for children, then we have the use of initiation as being reminded of what we all know, ordinary language philosophy, and then we have, so this is one picture, initiation, and then we have the kind of rebirth, conversion, turning of natural inclinations, which is typical of adult life and which can be connected, if we want, an earlier stage to adolescence, to what this philosopher called boyhood, and we can add girlhood. So this is the first two moments. I would like now to introduce a different perspective, a further perspective to rethink these two stages and these two moments. The idea I wish to suggest is that children have a role in the education of grown-ups, not only by exemplifying the scene of initiation, reminding us of the forms of life in which we were brought up, but also by inviting us to question such forms of life. Let us see how this may be so, how this can work. With their questions and attitudes, children have the capacity to unsettle the confidence in our culture on which our capacity for education is based. In different moments of his work, Cavell works also on this crucial point, which is a further point. He connects a famous section from Philosophical Investigations where Wittgenstein writes famously, "Once I have exhausted the justifications, I have reached bedrock and my spade is turned. Then I'm inclined to say, this is simply what I do." He connects this to the scene of instruction, thus portraying a child who does not follow the instructions. This is in conditions handsome and unhandsome. So you have a child who refuses to follow instructions. If in the Aristotelian and Magdalian understanding, if someone refuses to follow, if a small child refuses to follow instruction, is someone that falls outside the net, is someone lost, basically. And he was not, and she was not brought up in second nature, and okay, we are sorry, there's nothing we can do, nor nothing we can learn from that. Okay, so that is the picture. I'm sorry that I'm simplifying this in a very sketchy and terrible way. Now, so Cavell puts together this is simply what I do with the child that refuses to follow instructions, and introduces considerations on this. He describes this moment as one in which the teacher looks at the points of view of the teacher, in which the teacher allows the child to question her authority. So the teacher reads the child's refusal to follow her instructions as a questioning of her authority. This is something that can happen, this allowing, this letting the refusal be read as a questioning of your authority. In the claim of reason, this is actually the kind of situation which creates the occasion for the teacher to return to his culture, to the ground of what he knows. Now, he can be happy with that, saying, no, this is what we do. Or, as I said, it can be questioned in her and his authority. And if the child, and so Cavell says, but if the child, little or big, and the big child is, of course, an intimation to a reading of us as big children questioning our culture. And so we already have here the third stage, the big child. But if the child, little or big, asks me, why do we eat animals? Or why are some people poor and other rich? What is God? Why do I have to go to school? Do you love black people as much as white people? Or who owns the land? I may find my answers thin. I may feel run out of reasons without being willing to say, this is what I do, what I say, what I sense, what I know, and honor that. Part of the quotation I used it before. So the seeing of instruction directed at the children becomes, in this quotation, a scene of education for the teacher. The further question is, how can children do this? How can they educate us? What kind of power do their words and gestures possess in order to achieve this? The Wittgensteinian scene, where I'm inclined to say that this is simply what I do, denounces in Cavell, read by Cavell, a readiness for learning that Cavell comments as a kind of passivity. The teacher acknowledges her own passivity and accepts her own passivity, a capacity to take in, to acknowledge something which comes to us from another world, as it were, from another dimension. The notion of acknowledgement in Cavell's philosophy usually refers to being able to acknowledge a human separateness and finitude, animality, and terrestrial habitation. Children have the power to come to us, as it were, from an unknown world. I have begun with the idea that trained children are like primitives, savages, not fully human, perhaps inhabiting an uncanny condition. Of such creatures, it makes sense imagining to exclude them from our community as a reaction to their resistance to our teaching, as Wittgenstein does in the Brown Book, in a passage that Cavell quotes as a dark, comments as a dark Swiftian humor. Cavell says that Wittgenstein has a dark Swiftian humor, and Wittgenstein writes in the Brown Book, if a child in a certain tribe does not respond to the suggestive gesture to go on counting, it is separated from the others and treated as a lunatic. End of quote. Exclusion here is important. This is my comment. I take it as a sort of religious gesture, one that perhaps can be compared to Locke in the second treatise, when he describes those who transgress the laws of nature, who resists the laws of nature as beasts, as not properly human, animals that need to be killed. We can make sense of such an extreme gesture as what is required by the confrontation with something which is menacing our whole form of life. Children, in this quotation from the Brown Book, being separated as lunatic, children are represented here as monsters. Children can be monsters in their capacity to put into jeopardy our entire form of life. Children can be monsters, as it were, or perverse, as Freud argues in the 3 S's on the theory of sexuality. Within the scene of initiation, this perversity, this monstrosity is hidden behind our, what we take to be our unlimited power of training, which seems to encounter no resistance. Yet, portrayed as resisting us, children stand up as confronting us from their own world. Children inhabit their own uncanny world. Cavell also pursues this line of thought when he describes, as I quoted before, the child as the unobserved observer of the culture, which is a bit disquieting, a bit unheimlich, the invisible witness of its prospective culture, of its fated future. The child sheds his uncanny gaze over our world with the capacity to unsettle our convictions, to seduce us into an uncanny vision of ourselves. And I imagine here a possible comment on this, following psychoanalysis for the little that I can understand. So if you have, for example, Jean Laplanche on seduction, according to Laplanche, this might be helpful or not. According to Laplanche, the adult educator and caretaker is mysterious and uncanny to the child because she confronts the child with unknown and uncanny messages which the child cannot decode nor properly take in. This constitutes the primal trauma, which, repressed, will later emerge and form the adult's unconscious. It is this sense of strangeness which is activated in the adult in her encounter with the child's resistance to follow her instructions. The child brings back to the adult the disquieting sense that what was handed over to her, the entire form of life, which is now passing down to the child and in which name she's speaking, is actually foreign and mysterious. She actually gets back this sense of foreignness, mysteriousness, which belongs to this first trauma. And this is a possible gloss, a psychoanalytic gloss of what is going on with this children being able to question our authority, to pass over to them our forms of life. This has important consequences for, I'm almost at the end, for our original picture of initiation. We need to revise the original idea, the original sketch of these 2 stages. We now have to make room for the situation in which the child questions us within the scene of instruction, which was not visible, I repeat, in the way in which we brought together Aristotle, Hegel, McDowell, Cavell, and Wittgenstein, because there you don't have resistance. Resistance is an exception or is not philosophically interesting. Now, after what we said about these children, these disquieting children, these perverse children, we have to make room for the situation in which the child, as I said, questions us within the scene of instruction. In the scene of instruction, the child may resist our authority, seducing us into her world, which comes into view not simply as primitive, as opposed to our civilized place where we want to introduce her, but as alien and disquieting. It's another kind of contrast. It isn't simply that initiation is appropriate for children and change for adults who draw perhaps from the knowledge of adolescence, as we saw at the beginning, but that in order to have change, we need to allow for the possibility that children question us, for their being not merely passive patients of our initiation, but the active instruments of our own education, of our re-initiation into our forms of life, or of our refusal, what we have taken to be our forms of life. We need children. This wasn't visible at the beginning, because we had initiation and change, and children only belong to initiation, and change belong in a way to adolescence. We need children in order to unsettle our immature confidence in ourselves and our culture. Also, this contests the picture of initiation in another way. We do not simply train children, after all, as it is argued in the Aristotelian line, Rather, we educate them into a form of life, and this includes an education to the power to contest such a form of life. We do this since the beginning by allowing the possibility of their contestations to be taken as invitations to go back to our culture and be open to criticize it, to reform it, or perhaps to revolutionize it. Our education is, since the beginning, a leading, this idea of the Führen, which is so important in Wittgenstein, of the leading words back from metaphysics to ordinary language. Our education is since the beginning a leading which invites following and resisting. This way of seeing suggests a different conclusion from the one that we drew before. The scene of instruction cannot be accounted as the sort of initiation represented in the Aristotelian line explored by McDowell. The kind of passing down of language and culture we enact is never a mere passing down. It's never a mere training. It is always the passing of a dimension of life, language, and culture to which we are ourselves fated in Emerson and Cavell's terminology. We encountered before the notion of fate in a quotation before. There is a dimension which we inhabit, but which we also confront from the outside, a dimension we need to be prepared to inherit again, and from which we may become isolated and estranged. It is here that we see the importance of what I call modernist, of course, following Cavell's treatment of the notion of modernism. It is here that we see the importance of the modernist perspective, which places in view the experience of one's culture and conventions as confronting us from outside, from some other place, coming to us as an external entity, autonomous, and as such possessing the power to speak to us, to interrogate our sensibility, to question our allegiance to it, to question our capacity to speak in its name, or to question the willingness and motivation that we have in passing down this, or in refusing to passing down culture. In this perspective, the transmission of a culture is a matter of a sort of passivity which concerns the child and the teacher. In the first stage, you only have the passivity of the child, who lets himself be formed, forged, following a certain form. And the teacher is active, of course. Here you have also the passivity of the teacher. This is the picture that I'm trying to suggest, the following Cavell and Wittgenstein. The child lets his natural inclinations be forged, as I said before, in a certain direction. She allows her inclination to receive a certain form, the form of a certain life. She allows to be shaped with that form. The teacher accepts the pupil's resistance. There are occasions in which the teacher can accept, may accept, has a point to accept the pupil's resistance to her teaching as an invitation to question the culture she's passing down to her, accepts to be thrown back upon herself as the source of that teaching, isolated from it, and thus facing the enormity of the culture to which she belongs as something autonomous, requiring her consent. So this idea of a natural habitation in our forms of life comes out here as something that can be estranged from you and you confront it from outside. I think this is a crucial thing that we have in Cavell. Aristotle, that you don't have in the Aristotelian line. Aristotle and McDowell describe a kind of forging of the character which does not really meet resistances. And if it does, I commented this before, it is a problem for the trainee, it isn't a problem for the educator. Cavell also works with the idea of initiation, but, so there is something in common, as I said, but this notion of initiation should be understood as intended to bring attention only to one side of education, the other being the one which contests the idea of initiation and installs in its place the idea of a responsiveness of the teacher to the child, which requires the teacher's own re-initiation into the form of life she is transmitting. Can I go on another 5 minutes, Adrian and Paul? Yes. Okay. So I have a last section because I'm checking the time on the computer. I have a little aside on Thomas Hobbes, but the modernist moment I find so richly explored by Cavell turns and transforms a previous intellectual experience vividly depicted by Hobbes. At least this is my, in a way, naive. I'm not a scholar of Thomas Hobbes. There is the experience of a culture and civilization as, at the end of the day, external entities which never achieve to transform human nature entirely. A lower stratum of human nature persists and surfaces in the society portrayed in the Leviathan. In many ways, it takes on a rebellious face as well as the face of a natural freedom, which is never totally transformed in a new political inclination of allegiance to the sovereign. He has positive and negative sides in the Leviathan. On the one hand, the two intellectual moments need to be kept separate, modernism and the 17th century, of course. The modernist moment expresses an internal need of reform or revolution of culture, something which belongs to the fact that culture is natural to us, and thus also something to which we may naturally come to feel estranged. And this is, of course, Wittgensteinian and Freudian, whereas the early modern Hobbesian moment expresses a fact about the irremediable artificiality of culture, the fact that it can never become natural to us. So these things needs to be kept separate. On the other hand, there is an important line of continuity between the two intellectual moments. As Cavell writes about Wittgenstein's examples of strange tribes who measure wood in weird ways, those tribes of big children can put us in mind how little in each of us gets educated. Our education meets a resistance which requires for the modernist a new assessment of culture and of our natural habits. The child is a familiar stranger. Now, this line of continuity from Hobbes to modernism helps us to see the important difference with the Aristotelian line. This is why I'm bringing it up, which pictures human nature as the well-formed transformation of a material which has nothing to say to us. In the Aristotelian perspective, what counts is always second nature. Initiation indicates this process of formation, which brings you in a world which has no outside, as it were, no contestation. I've indicated before how powerful this picture is, how the idea of initiation works well in the Aristotelian, Wittgensteinian perspective elaborated by McDowell. The education of children, therefore, seems a matter which needs to acknowledge that they are also familiar strangers. It needs to acknowledge that they confront us coming from a different world, and that this may isolate us from the culture we are passing down to them. So we reach a different conclusion. This is the end. The education of children cannot be separated from the education of grown-ups. The initiation of children into the world of culture and autonomy is also the education of grown-ups to confront culture from the outside, the education to the experience of isolation and separateness. Children are familiar strangers. We are also familiar strangers to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre Giorgio. Okay, so lots to think about there. So opening up to everyone for discussion.